Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast, your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. Well, in this episode, it's going to be more on the serious side. I'm going to talk about the Palestine-Israeli conflict, some developments in the rhetoric that I think are just beneath us as a people. And yes, many of the people who are speaking these words are career rabble-rousers and critics and politicians even. But the language is just beneath us, and it needs to go the way of the dodo. I'm also going to speak to the absolute and utter calamity, failure that was the Israeli security state. The promise being that, yes, you're going to give up personal freedom, but you're going to give it up because we're going to keep you safe. Well, how did that promise turn out? And can you accept that promise from anyone in the government in the 21st century? And on a lighter note, congratulations to the Arizona Diamondbacks making the league championship series, the National League Championship Series, by beating the Los Angeles Dodgers in a sweep. That's right, I'm getting all bandwagonish. I'm going to jump on. I'm going to root for the D-backs to take out the Phillies and potentially go to another World Series, win another World Series. Thank you all for continuing to support the podcast. I do appreciate it. Give it a like, a thumbs up, 5 stars, write a review. This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast is on Patreon. If you like what you hear, please consider supporting.
Episode Preface: Be careful what you wish for.
As many of the dear, loyal listeners know, I believe firmly that we speak our existence into reality. That's how we manifest it. We speak the words. We think the thoughts. Many of these things are running unconsciously in us. They are influencing our subconscious. I'm now getting into a number of writings that argue that our subconscious is actually part of God, that our ability to heal ourselves, that our breathing being regulated by this unseen, unknown force, yet it seems to know all, and it listens to us without a sense of humor. Our subconscious does not understand wit or sarcasm, doesn't understand double entendres. Our subconscious takes everything that we think and everything that we say literally and tries to manifest it for us. That's why with so much hate and division in the world, if we speak that, we'll find it. That's always going to exist. If we speak love and truth and understanding, we'll find that as well. That's always going to exist. What are people speaking into existence at this day and time in the 21st century, where we all believe ourselves to be so much more sophisticated than any other generation of human beings that ever lived, with all the technological marvels that we are now being introduced to? What's being spoken out into the ethos? What is now creating the parameters of the new zeitgeist? Let's just kill them all. Let's just kill all of them. You were hearing this from the top levels, the highest echelons of the government out of the state of Israel in their military. You're hearing it now from American, and I hate to use this word, influencers. You're seeing this on social media in the United States, and it's actually starting to creep in to the language of politicians in the U.S. This is extremely dangerous rhetoric, and it is so extreme and so dangerous that outside of the normal podcast structure that I've created, I'm creating this segment as a preface to the rest of the episode. Act 1 was going to be a standalone. It was going to be me addressing what I felt was the primary issue in the conflict, this most recent massacre by Hamas on innocent Israeli civilians. A story that's now becoming more and more prevalent in the news coverage here in the United States, but is all the rage in Israel and in many of the media or news outlets across the Middle East. And it's the complete and total failure of the security state in Israel. More on that in the next segment. I felt compelled to do this segment to caution all of us from allowing, and I mean this, allowing language like kill them all to start re-entering the zeitgeist. Understand something, and this irony, it hits me like an anvil. I don't have a little umbrella to put up. This isn't a cartoon from the 50s or the 60s or the 70s. This hits me like an anvil. The irony of it. Here we have in the state of Israel, people who suffered through the Holocaust. When I use that term, we all know what it references. This is Nazi Germany in its plan to exterminate a race of people, the Jews. And because they didn't discriminate as much as we like to give them credit for, they were going after homosexuals, they were going after mental and physical retardation. They were going to clean things up in their mind such that the Aryan race would be untainted for all future generations. What do you feel is the advent of something like that? You hear many a Holocaust survivor ask rhetorically, what would lead men to do such things? Such barbarity, such depravity. What would lead them to become such monsters to their fellow man? Well, the universe has answered. And I'm not saying that what Hamas did was not barbaric and depraved. And I'm not saying that there isn't a cause for retribution. When you start hearing people utter the words, let's just kill them all, really put that into perspective, dear listener. Two things. One, yes, this is how that type of action begins to enter the zeitgeist, where people start to say that and it gets normalized and there aren't really that many objections. No one's shouting them down. You have that now entering the lexicon of the conversation, and you don't have any political or social influences with a lot of sway. Granted, because of the now crowdsourced nature of news and of the influence of social media, you're always going to have different voices, and you're going to have different rational voices. You're going to have people who are trying to take a step back and look at events from a much bigger perspective or picture than just a microcosm of things that have happened. Have you heard a number of politicians come out and decry these affirmations? I mean, these are affirmations for violence, and violence on a grand scale. These are people speaking these words into existence and then basically probing us as a populace, as a humanity. Is this going to be acceptable? Like, will people start to allow this to be an element of the conversation? And then maybe we can get more acceptance, and maybe there can be a groundswell for this type of action. Free speech is free speech. Yet there has to be a limit on what someone can say without it being challenged, without it being completely dismissed. And to hear so many different people bang the drum for war, and then have in the background of that conversation a few people say, and let's just kill all of them. Let's just exterminate them. That is extremely troubling. In a country, no less, that was basically founded out of the horror of the Holocaust. You have people who are ancestors of those who survived the Holocaust now calling for the extermination of another people. And I have no doubt that they feel justified. And if you look at some of the events that have occurred over the course of not just the past few weeks, but over the past few years, certainly you can make a case as to why there needs to be harsh or decisive action. Whether or not it's justified isn't the question. Isn't the question whether or not we're going to allow ourselves to become the type of monster that could then commit an atrocity such as the Holocaust. The principles involved in the architecture of the Holocaust, no doubt in my mind, they felt justified in what they were doing. They thought they were doing the right thing. No matter how monstrous or barbaric it was, they thought that they were doing the right thing. Justification isn't the question. The question is there something which these Holocaust survivors had been asking for decades? Is there something that could drive man to the point of treating other human beings not even like animals, almost like objects, inanimate objects that you had no emotional connection to, that you had no mental or spiritual connection to whatsoever. Now let's get to the second point. Who's going to do this? Who's actually going to go in there and do the exterminating? Who is going to pull the trigger? This is a huge question in my mind when you get all of these people clamoring for such violent action, particularly if they're living in the United States. Who's going to actually have to pull the trigger? Even if it's a pilot pulling the trigger or pushing a button. Who's going to have to do it? Whose conscience is this going to weigh on if that is in fact the action that needs to be taken? You see Israel call up these 300,000 reservists, and they're going to siege Gaza, and it's going to be the second coming of Fallujah. People are going to get killed. And you know who's going to get killed? Civilians. And you know what kind of civilians? Kids. Little kids. And we didn't like to talk about it when Barry was president. Hope and Change had bold things to say about the war in Iraq when he was on the campaign trail for his first presidential election. That tune changed when he actually got into office. And you know why? Because he was presented with the amount of civilians that we were killing, the amount of women that our military was killing, and in particular, the amount of children that our military was killing. And we have seen as these veterans have come back to the world and had to live with what they did years after finding out that the entire mission was nonsense in the first place, that's a heavy weight to put on anyone. So all of these people, the Lindsey Grahams of the world who want us to attack Iran and we've got to go in there and siege Gaza, who's the we? Nikki Haley may say that this is an attack on our entire country. No, it's not. Because you know what? We're not going to have to spill any blood in order to vindicate the victims of these Hamas attacks. We're not the ones who are going to have their family members walk into a densely populated urban area that's been decimated by bombs, by shelling, and have to then, and I was just about to say room by room, but many of those buildings don't have rooms anymore. They're literally piles of rubble. You're going to have to sift through piles of rubble to make sure that there's no one hiding in there to shoot you from behind after you pass by the building. It's going to be a Herculean task, and there are going to be significant casualties. What's that going to do? It's going to escalate the conflict, and there will be children killed. There will be children your children's age killed. There will be children younger than your children's age. There will be infants killed. There will be plenty of pregnant women killed. It's going to be an absolute and total shit show. And you don't hear many Christians saying it, but this is where Christ comes through me. My heart is open. My imagination is open. This is what love and loving your neighbor actually means. There are certainly guilty parties that need to be brought to justice with regard to Hamas, its infrastructure, how it operates within Gaza. I'm not going to go into all of that. To go in and just kill every living person, which is basically what you're going to be presented with doing if you go in to siege an urban area like the Gaza Strip and you don't provide any way for those people to get out, it's going to be a massacre. And you're going to have people living with what they did in those circumstances. And it's not going to be vindication and justification and anger 5, 10, 15 years after the deed is done. So the question in my mind has been answered. What would drive human beings to the point where they were willing to kill other human beings so indiscriminately? Well, you've seen them. And whether or not you believe that the actions to be justified based on the events that occurred over the past couple of weeks, then you are in your own mind at the same level as anyone operating in Nazi Germany in 1943. Do you understand that? You can actually sympathize with those people. You can sympathize with different groups that have spoken about and then lobbied for and then participated in the genocide of another race of people. This is what it looks like. This is how you get there. Don't be so naive. Don't be so gullible as to believe that there's a 0 to 60 factor here, that there's no problem whatsoever, and then somehow there's some kind of escalation, mob mentality takes over, and people go out and want to exterminate another race of people. That's not how it works. It's a slow burn. Things happen. There aren't many people in the United States, there aren't many people around the globe that really want to talk about the fact that the Gaza Strip is basically an open-air concentration camp. And there may be some of those who are listening, some of you who believe that that is warranted. Be that as it may, it exists. It is a condition that is in existence. And if you think that that's the optimal solution, well, there were a lot of other people once that thought putting Jews in ghettos was the optimal solution. And it was basically a hair's trigger away from, well, let's just kill them all. And many people might listen to this and think, you're sympathizing with Hamas or with the Palestinians. Let me tell you what I think the Israelis should do, because I don't really want to speculate anymore about how events will transpire. Let me tell you what I think that they should do, though. And this is less a feeling than it is all of the books that I've read, all of the history that I've watched. You know what the Israelis should do? Nothing. It would take strength. It would take character. It would take force of leadership. Israel should do nothing. Absolutely nothing. Let it sit for 30 or 60 or even 90 days. Those responsible will pop their heads up again. And Israel had the most colossal failure in a security state in probably the history of man. Again, I'll go into that in the next segment. Israel should wait and bide their time, because all of those people will come up on their radar, on their technology radar, and they will be able to then periodically, systematically dismantle Hamas by taking them all out. You avoid the bloodshed of a siege. You avoid your people, your countrymen, having to go kill women and children. And you can ultimately achieve the objective that you've been claiming you wanted to achieve for years, and that's dismantle Hamas. I mean, everybody just raised their hand and said, I'm a member of Hamas and I'm participating in this atrocity. There's no one in the world who's going to say, hey, if that person comes here, you can't have a crack at him. It's just, you can't do that where we're located. You can't do that on our soil. The people who participated in those attacks are persona non grata on planet Earth. You're going to have a chance to get them, and you're going to have a chance to get at those people who organized the attacks. Wait, bide your time. Will that happen? Of course not, because in our modern political climate, in this landscape, all these politicians have to look strong. They don't have to actually be strong, because they're a reflection of us. Are we that strong that we elect these people? No. They are pandering to our basest instincts. So when something like this happens, they have to come up with a presentation of strength, even though they're not strong people. And the presentation of strength is, let's just go in there and kill a bunch of people. Let's use overwhelming force, the presentation of strength, military might, and let's just kill a bunch of people. You and I both know that outcome. You're basically turning the entire Gaza Strip, 2.5 million people, into future terrorists. When they see the bloodshed, the carnage that's going to be inflicted on their countrymen, on their relatives, on their nuclear family, they are going to be incensed and they are going to be easy to radicalize in the future. And the cycle just keeps repeating. The short answer is love, dear listener. The long answer is be patient. Wait, bide your time. Opportunities will provide a path to actually take out all of Hamas and to cripple their infrastructure. We don't have the strength at this point, dear listener, to elect the type of leaders that could do that. We wouldn't give our leaders that type of opportunity, given our bloodlust. And I'm very afraid that we are just inviting another opportunity for another Holocaust to occur right under our noses, and yet at the same time sit in judgment of others that allowed such a thing to happen 50, 100 years ago.
Act 1: The Israeli-Palestinian Conundrum. There are no guarantees, only guarantors.
I'm a history buff, and there's a conspiracy theory that floats around the entrance of the United States into World War II that circles around whether or not the U.S. government had forewarning that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor. I will not go into all of the intricacies of this conspiracy theory. There were many indications that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor, and given the scope of the attack, given the fact that it was carried out with so many airplanes, so many ships, so many aircraft carriers, it almost begged to be discovered. Why, you might ask, on a 30,000-foot level, would the United States government allow for such an attack to occur if it had forewarning? The theory being that Roosevelt wanted the United States to enter the war much earlier, that foreign powers were begging the United States to enter the war. Roosevelt, he understood that the world was becoming more and more globalized, that isolationist tendencies, they were not going to last, that was just that older anachronistic mentality that was on its way out, yet still had a hold on many of the American people, but particularly many influential American politicians. You may offer, dear listener, that these isolationist tendencies, they ebb and they flow. And that's very true. Can you really argue, though, that the United States could remain an isolationist nation in the 20th century, particularly the mid part of the 20th century? Globalization was upon us. Whether we like it or not, today or 100 years ago, the path of progress, the arc of progress, was heading towards globalization. We've steadily made that advance towards globalism, and Roosevelt saw that coming well before a lot of other people, hell, even so-called progressives saw it coming. He wanted to enter the war. He had too much resistance. He couldn't get the Senate to cooperate, and I want to touch on that very briefly. Let's think about that very briefly. It's not the point of the segment, and yes, I'll be making that point very shortly, but that was a time when the president, with consent from the United States Senate, went to war, and without consent from the United States Senate, did not. And in the largest war in the history of humankind, the United States Senate said no, said we're not going to cooperate. It's just a far cry from where we are today, where we think that we have so much division. Like I say all the time, there's no difference whatsoever between the political parties. That division is all superficial. The president bangs the gong, rings the bell for war, and the entire Congress gets into line, right? A lot of money to be made by a lot of different political actors when there's a war, and there always seems to be a war. You've got people in the Republican Party, even in the Democratic Party now, saying without equivocation that we should attack Iran based on what's going on in Gaza. And this is absent any real intelligence as to how this all happened, which we'll get to in a second. So Roosevelt wants to enter the war. There's this trickle, if you will, and then there's this flow, and then there's this stream, and then there's this flood of information, according to some of these conspiracy theorists, that Japan is going to attack the United States, is going to try to destroy the Pacific aircraft carrier fleet in Pearl Harbor. Well, the theory goes, by letting that happen, the American people would be incensed, would be enraged. We'd have to go to war with Japan, which means that we'd very likely be going to war with Nazi Germany, and the United States would enter World War II. Do I believe that? No. As I state frequently on this podcast, generally, most actions taken by human beings, no matter who they are, under what conditions, under what circumstances, given what authority, they are done so by negligence, by ignorance. Very rarely do we undertake these things in malice aforethought. With knowledge, I'm going to make this strategic chess move. We'd like to think it all works out that way, and it is so invigorating to see it play out on a show like Mad Men or Breaking Bad. It just doesn't happen that way in real life. That's why those are television shows, and that's why we love them, and real life is so boring. It's just a quandary, which is a nice way of saying clusterfuck, of mistakes piled on its most artful form, layered on top of one another. Some people taking advantage of those, some people being taken advantage of because of those. Where am I going with all of that? The most likely scenario for why Pearl Harbor happened the way that it did was because people in positions of power and authority simply didn't believe the intelligence that they were receiving. The Japanese wouldn't be that stupid, they wouldn't be that audacious, and even if they were as stupid and audacious as to attack us, we'd smoke them anyway. We'd smoke them. They're not a formidable fighting force. Yes, they can go in and invade all of these other countries with primitive 19th century militaries. Hell, some of them even 18th century militaries. They would never try that with us, and if they did, we'd kill them. Famous last words. Let's look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the events that have taken place over the course of the past week. And I'm not going to comment on those events at all. The only thing that I'm going to comment on is the fact that they took place under the auspice that it was a surprise, that these were surprise attacks by Hamas against Israeli citizens in different parts of the state of Israel, through the land and the sea and the air, that they had such coordinated, secret, well-organized plans, and it was a complete and total surprise. That is troubling to me, more so than anything else involving what happened. And I want to repeat that, because that may be controversial to you, dear listener. That is troubling to me more than anything else that's happening in these day-to-day events. Let's place what happened in the context of the relationship between Israel and Palestine, and the fact that Israel has one of the most thorough, one of the most dynamic, one of the most invasive surveillance states in the world at this time. And that is stating as much, knowing that the United States does what it does, having Edward Snowden come out and show us what the U.S. does. Israel doesn't just rival the United States, it may exceed the United States. We aren't talking about two peers. We're talking about one state having such invasive spyware technology that many nations across the world, despotic nations, authoritarian states, buy this technology to spy on their own citizens. Not to protect their businesses, not to protect their citizenry, to spy on their own citizens in order to keep the power that they have, their despotic seat. You can go out and find articles in 20 seconds on Google. The Google machine has plenty of them about criticisms of the Israeli government, of the Israeli surveillance state, and selling these technologies to these despots, these authoritarian regimes that have all sorts of human rights violations. That the Israeli surveillance services, these intelligence services, should not be commercializing these technologies and selling them to these, what we would call in the West, bad actors around the world. In addition, many of the things that were accomplished in the war against Al-Qaeda, in the war against ISIS, with different types of militant groups all over the world, we rely heavily on intelligence from Israel, and we rely heavily on human intelligence from Israeli assets. Israel has some of the best spies in the world. Not just spies that they have trained, but they cultivate assets in other regions of the world who are not Israeli. They may be Iranian. They may be Syrian. They may be Russian. And they work with intelligence service assets in Israel for political reasons, for social reasons, hell, for money. May I remind you, dear listener, that when we blew up, essentially, the centrifuges for the Iranian nuclear program, we had that virus, that code that we devised that would get the centrifuges to spin too fast without the Iranians knowing it. We developed that in conjunction with the Israelis. The Israelis had the assets inside of Iran to get that virus, to get that technology, that code into the computers that were running this nuclear lab. So it wasn't the United States alone. In fact, I'm not sure that mission could have been accomplished as quickly if not for the assets cultivated by the Israeli spies. Think about everything that I just said. Put it into context and then look at what just happened. You're talking about a much less sophisticated actor in Hamas. You're talking about a much less sophisticated endeavor than sabotaging a nuclear program in an independent nation that you've been at war with, if not a hot war, certainly a cold war, since the 1970s. The kinds of technologies that we've developed today, I mean, frankly, from what I understand, one can simply send a text using some of these Israeli spyware technologies to another phone. No one has to open anything. No one has to do anything. That text alone can then dig in and break any code inside of that phone, and that phone, it's essentially a video recorder, an audio recorder. All the information inside of it is available to whomever is using this software, this technology. They can hack anything. And certainly, you'd think, given that Hamas is a sworn enemy of the state of Israel, that this stuff would be running in the background 24/7. They'd be spying on any principal that has any relationship to Hamas. How can this entity, this organization, Hamas, organize in such coordinated fashion attacks from the air, from the sea, from the land, and do so in such a way that it is completely under the radar of the entire U.S. and Israeli intelligence services? I have stated many times, I do not like conspiracy theories. I do not believe in many conspiracy theories. It is either a commentary on the complete and total uselessness of having this global spyware apparatus as a pretense to keeping us safe. I mean, maybe it's information overload. The fact of the matter is, it just doesn't work. Or it does work. The Israeli government, the Israeli military, the Israeli Defense Force, their police, there were plenty of warnings that were received by all of these different entities. That information was escalated to the appropriate authorities, and they didn't do anything about it. Ladies and gentlemen, dear listeners, this is not an existence of safety. We were born, we're all going to die. We have no right to, we do not deserve to have some kind of preserved or definite term of life. There are no guarantees. And if there were, the last place that you're going to find them is in a government. It's not as chaotic a world as people are making it out to be, yet it is an uncertain world. And when we give up all of our freedoms to a governmental entity in the hopes that they're going to be able to keep us safe, we're seeing what that is. We're seeing these technologies be used to spy domestically on political or social actors, and yet when they're supposed to be used to keep us safe, they are completely neglected. And yes, I think what happened, the long and short of it is, there was probably so much noise coming out of the Gaza Strip, coming out of Hamas, that a lot of it was ignored. I was just recently rewatching the documentary that was done on PBS. I believe it was Ken Burns on North Korea, when the United States and its Korean allies had pushed the North Koreans back close to the Yalu River in China. And there were report after report coming out of China, coming out of a number of different sources, that the Chinese were massing an army next to this much smaller U.S. and Korean force, and that the Chinese were ready to counterattack. And MacArthur in particular, Douglas MacArthur, the general of the campaign, he didn't believe it. He just didn't believe it. It wasn't that the information wasn't obtained, and it wasn't that there wasn't a structure or an apparatus in order to obtain that type of information. Once the information was conveyed, it simply was not believed. It was not given the credulity that was necessary in order for proper actions to be taken. The Chinese counterattacked. Many Americans and Koreans died as a result, and now we have a two-state system on the peninsula of Korea. We have a north and a south, which would not have been the case had not that information been ignored. What do I believe happened? What do I suspect is going to be the verdict in the next 2 years when all of the information is assessed as to how Hamas was able to pull off what they did? I think all the information is going to be there. I think there's going to be countless different pieces of information that would have led anyone competent to believe Hamas is gathering forces, is organizing to do something on the anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. And if you aren't familiar with the Yom Kippur War, very quickly in 1967, Egypt and Syria were agitating for an attack. The Israelis struck first. That was called the 6-Day War. The Israelis took territory in the Golan Heights. They took the Gaza Strip. They took the Sinai Peninsula. It was a huge humiliation for the Arab states. 6 years later, in 1973, in a surprise attack that wasn't really that much of a surprise because the Egyptians and the Syrians both had feigned doing this so frequently that the Israelis became complacent and just thought they were exercises. They attack Israel. They're able to make a lot of headway that they were not able to accomplish in any other conflict against Israel. The long and short of it is, although Israel was able to counterattack and really inflict some serious damage to Syria and Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula was eventually given back to Egypt in a peace accord. And it was actually the prompting of this weird quasi-governmental oversight of the Gaza Strip by Israel, which was to be relinquished. I don't want to get into all of that. The point being that if you were getting information that Hamas was planning some sort of anniversary party in honor of the Yom Kippur War, and you ignored it, what use is this overarching, this draconian security state that we've allowed to be created in not only a state like Israel, but in a state, in a country like the United States? What's the point if the people in charge are too goddamn incompetent to actually assess the information that they're provided? The information itself is meaningless. It's those who are in charge and who are assessing it. That's what's important. And if we don't improve that part of the equation, we're just going to have more and more incidents like this, which are going to prompt more and more people to want more and more draconian security measures so that some other incompetent boob in the future can screw something up, and that we can even have more saber rattling for less freedom, that we need to give up more and more of our freedoms in order to be quote unquote safe. This is the quintessential incident for failing up, for allowing something to happen that so shocks the consciousness of a community of people, or hell, the global community itself, that you then allow those that failed to fail up and to capture more power. We've seen it with COVID. We saw it with the January 6th protest, riot, insurrection, whatever you want to call it. We're seeing it over and over again. Those people in power being allowed to fail up. This isn't doom and gloom. I'm not going to simply decry the direction that we're going in, because I've got to flip the script. I've got to go back to, let's look at it from below instead of above. Maybe these are the types of things that we need to see happen, where we stand up and say, hey, the security state is not the solution. In fact, having a better understanding of why these conflicts exist, that's the solution. Or even if we're going to remain in our ignorance as to why a conflict that's been going on for, 100 years might actually overflow into violence on occasion, at least we start to elect and put into positions of power and authority people who do know why those conflicts may escalate, may bubble over, and we try to empower them to solve these problems instead of continuing to elect the same incompetent boob that leads us to the path where we need to give up more of our freedom in order to feel safe. Safety in many ways is like sand. The more you squeeze it, the more you try to hang on to it, the more of it slips through your fingers. This entire incident is going to breed conspiracy theories. And that's why I wanted to propose a conspiracy theory to you about one of the most pivotal events in U.S. history as the illustration that safety, it's only in your mind. It's peace of mind. If you see the world is violent and out of control, you are always going to find that because it's always going to be there. Giving away your personal freedom to the point where you're living voluntarily in a place like China or North Korea, that's not going to make you ever feel better. And if it does, dear listener, if it does, don't bring me into the fold and don't try. Go move to North Korea, go move to China, go move to Iran right now. Save us from the rest of it. Save us from what it will be to live in a state like that, just so a few of us can claim that they feel safe. Our rise in our level of consciousness must be to recognize that there are no guarantees in this life. There are only guarantors. And can we really trust the guarantors that we've put into place?
Act 2. Congratulations, Diamondbacks.
At the time of this recording, the Arizona Diamondbacks have defeated, in a sweep, mind you, the Los Angeles Dodgers to progress, to advance on to the League Championship Series. I think the first time since 2013. Maybe that was since 2010. It's been a minute. And as I have stated on the podcast in previous episodes, this was not the team that anyone predicted would advance to the League Championship Series, much less make the playoffs. Limping into those playoffs, backdooring, if you will, with 4 straight losses and a sweep by the Houston Astros at home. Yet, as kids will do, and this is a team full of kids, the kids they didn't let that faze them. It didn't even seem to be a drop of water off of the ass of one proverbial duck. They just went out and decided not to lose any more baseball games, sweeping both the NL Central champions, the Milwaukee Brewers, and the NL West champions, the Los Angeles Dodgers. What I find most compelling about this story is that they limped their way into the playoffs, 4 straight losses, thanks to other teams losing baseball games. They were able to make the playoffs. They get down 3-0 in the first game of the playoff in Milwaukee. They come back, I believe, in the 3rd inning. They score a number of runs. They end up blowing out the Brewers in that game. In game 2, it's the same thing. The Diamondbacks get down. It looks like they might get knocked out, that the Brewers actually woke up. Nope, the Diamondbacks come back. They win that game as well. And it's been a mountain of success in the first few innings ever since. That's what a young team needs. They need success in the first few innings to let them know, hey, we're legit. This run is legit. We can compete with anyone. It's much easier to come back in innings 3, 4, 5, or 6 than it is 7, 8, and 9. If you get down, you feel much more confident scoring runs in those middle innings versus having to pull a rabbit out of your hat in the last few at-bats that you have. This all coming, mind you, from someone that's never played minor league or professional baseball. That's my expert opinion, knowing nothing about what it is to sit in that locker room or sit in that dugout in inning 4 being down 5-1. But, and I mean to use that word intentionally, but why not entertain this hot take from someone who doesn't know what they're talking about? Because that seems to be a theme in not only sports, but in politics, in international affairs. We seem to have a bunch of inexperienced, incompetent boobs making nation-defining, life-altering decisions on our behalf. Why not listen to someone that has no experience in Major League Baseball speak to what it is to be a young professional baseball team advancing so meteorically in the playoffs? I'll save the rest of my input, I'll save the rest of my thoughts for what I hope is going to be a National League and American League Division Series playoff preview for the next episode. And now, granted, based on the timing of when this podcast comes out, I want to have it to where we can speak to the teams that are going to be in that division series, in the NL Division Series and the AL Division Series, but the games will already be underway. So that's a little bit of a bummer, though if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you know that not all of the hot sports takes will be contemporaneous to those events. If you're demanding as much from me, dear listener, please head on to Patreon, contribute generously, and maybe I'll stop the 9 to 5 so that I can provide you with these prescient forecasts, these hot sports takes, without the trivial expiration of time, thus proving me and practically every other person on social media and in the legacy media wrong. This is Why Don't Vote, a podcast.